Hey, I'm Bob at I Like to Make Stuff. Today we're going to rehab some secondhand tools and put them to work in the shop. This isn't a typical project video, as you might be used to. I'll have one of those later in the week, but today I thought I would walk you through me restoring or preparing these tools for use in my shop. When people are looking to buy new tools, often it's really expensive and they just don't have the funds to put towards something brand new, and buying used tools is a great way around that. I always recommend that people look at yard sales and on Craigslist or something like that local to you where you can find used tools that you can get started with. You can always replace those with new tools later if you need to. But oftentimes the used stuff will last for a really long time. So these are two tools that I recently got at an estate sale. Got a big Delta drill press, this is from the 90s, and it's in pretty good shape, and I also got a belt grinder. The drill press seems to be in perfect working condition, but there is a lot of surface rust. So the first thing we're gonna do is take care of that rust, and then just kind of shine the whole thing up and make it look good. The belt grinder needs a little bit more attention. There's actually some bent pieces on it that we might need to refabricate, and there's just some cleanup and maybe some paint that we'll do to it. But first, let's handle the rust on the drill press. This first part might be the best tip of the whole video, I'm not really sure, but it's really about a product that I use to remove rust. It's not sponsored by this company, in fact I don't even know the name of the company, but the product is called OSPO. It's a solution that you put onto surface rust and it immediately turns that surface rust into a black primer. If it's thick, you can sometimes kind of chip it away, or if it's not, you can just paint directly over it. I've used it in the past on body panels for scooters when I restored them, and it worked great then, so it should work fine now. We're gonna try it on this flat surface down here so you can see it working. You don't need to use very much. You can pour it directly on, but I don't want to waste any, so I'm not gonna do that. In this case, I'm just gonna put it heavily onto this rag and wipe it onto one section. I won't even cover all of it so you can see the contrast between these two. Now this stuff does not work with very deep rust. It only works on surface rust. It's not gonna go deep enough to actually do anything if there's a lot of depth. This stuff does not smell very good. I don't think it's super dangerous, but it definitely stinks, so you wanna have some ventilation to get the air away from you. It's probably not visible on the camera, but right here there are a bunch of tiny little bubbles that are popping up as the chemical reaction's happening. You gotta leave this stuff on for about 30 minutes, and after that time you'll start to see it changing colors, and eventually it'll go mostly black. It also seems to work best if you kind of pool it, so you can see it's thinner over here. It's almost a little bit cloudy right here because that's where all the bubbles are doing work and changing the material. You can see it working, but like I said, it takes about 30 minutes to fully do it. If it's really thick surface rust, you're probably gonna need to do a couple of coats, but the instructions are really simple and they're on the back of the container. I put some on this bottom section around the same time, and it's got a lot more actual stuff that you can see is getting moved around, thicker material. So I'm gonna use a sanding block to start tearing some of this up, and we'll see how much of a difference it makes. And then this is the section where I didn't put any back here and I put it up front just to show you the difference that it makes. I mean, that's pretty significant right there. And I think another coat of this will actually make it look even better. But just the difference between this surface and this right here with very little work is pretty awesome. This is the second coat here on the bottom, being undisturbed for about 30 minutes, and it's bubbled up into this black primer. And when it scrapes away, there's still some blackness underneath it, but there's very little, if any, rust. You can keep this process going as much as you want till you get down to the surface that you actually want to see, but in this case, this would be good enough to paint it or seal it, and it would probably be good to go. Over the last couple days, I've done a few coats on here and I've sanded it back with both the sanding block and with an orbital sander on the final time, so it's nice and smooth. The OSPO is not used here to make a nice shiny surface. It's really prepping for paint. In this case, I'm not planning on painting it, I really just wanted to get rid of the rust. Before I move on and clean anything else up, I want to protect those surfaces a little bit. I'm going to use this T9. They're not a sponsor either. It's just a product that I've used on my table saw and my bandsaw tables, anywhere to keep rust off of those. I just spray on a decently thick coat and then just kind of smear it around and leave it on there. You don't want to wipe it all off. I also used a gel lubricant to put back here on the main post so that the table can move up and down pretty easily. At this point, everything is working just fine. Most of the rust is gone, which is pretty good. So now I just need to clean off the plastic parts. I'll do that with some Windex and paper towels, but let's move on to the belt grinder. The belt grinder is in really good shape. It does work. You can definitely move. It's got a buffing wheel here on the back, which will be nice and handy. Overall, it's in really good shape. There's a couple of small rust spots here and here that I'm gonna fix the same way I fixed on the drill press, but there's really two things that actually need to be fixed on this. The first of the two things is this little work table. It's a piece of aluminum, it's got some bend in it, it's got some damage to it. It may work just fine, but I'm gonna replace it with this piece of steel, which is unnecessarily thick. It's about the same depth. I'm gonna cut it down to the same width and then drill some holes and just screw it on. The other thing that's actually maybe a little bit more of a safety issue is this side where the belt is missing a panel that covers the belt. It still runs fine, it's not really a problem unless something falls down into that area. You don't want something to get caught in the belt. So I'm gonna make a really thin aluminum cover that just fits over that section. To protect that cover, I probably will have to paint it, so I may end up taking some of this apart and painting it maybe ILikeToMakeStuff orange. I don't know, we'll find out, but let's make those two parts. I like to use a white paint pen when I'm working on metal because it makes it really easy to see and it stays on the material. I made some marks and then connected them with a speed square just to make sure that everything was square and straight. I'm cutting this down with a metal cutting saw and I'm going to use a metal cutting bandsaw, but you could also just use an angle grinder with a cutoff wheel. It'd be a lot less expensive if you don't have access to metalworking tools. I just notched this area out and then I put it down in the vise and used a file to flatten out the cuts. This isn't super important, but that's the surface where the belt's gonna pass by, so I wanted to try to get it flat. I laid over the old table and then marked with the paint pen a couple of places to drill some holes. I used a center punch and actually made a little divot so that the drill bit had a place to start. Then I used a step bit to drill these holes out. I put a belt on the grinder and used it to round over all of the edges and the corners just to make sure that nothing was too sharp. I ran over the whole surface with a flap disc to get it back down to bare metal for the most part. The missing cover didn't have to be super specific. It's got quite a bit of room around it, so I got some rough measurements and then marked them out on a piece of steel. Originally I was going to use aluminum, but the aluminum that I had on hand was really thin and probably wouldn't have been very beneficial. I cut it down to length on my saw and then scored the lines where I was going to bend it. I used a cutoff wheel on an angle grinder and just very lightly ran across this line with a couple of passes. My vise was not as wide as this piece, so I used a piece of angle iron in the vise as a point to bend this over. This didn't work super well, but it doesn't have to be pretty, so a hammer knocked it into shape. I flipped it over and bent the other side, and the other one worked a little bit better. Scoring these a little bit deeper would have made the bend much more precise. I hammered this into shape and just made sure that it fit over the area I needed it to go. Then I traced out a little cap to put on the end of it. I held the two pieces together and just attached them with a few tack welds before filling in the weld all the way across. Tacking pieces like this first, make sure that they don't get misshapen while you're adding the full weld. Once I had it fully welded together, I just came back with the angle grinder and smoothed it out on all of the surfaces. I made sure that it fit over the cover and then marked a couple of areas to drill holes so that I could add some thumb screws to hold it in place. I drilled out a couple of holes. The size didn't really matter because the threads were already in the machine, and then I spray painted the cover orange. I sprayed the work table with a couple of coats of clear enamel. This won't last forever, but it will help fight some of the rust that might build up on this. I kind of lucked out and found two thumb screws in my stock that just worked perfectly for putting on this cover. After that, it was ready to test out. I got a scrap piece of metal and just played around with it a little bit, making sure that the belt was staying in place as it was supposed to, and then everything seemed to be working fine. I forgot to mention something about rust removal. The OSPO that I used earlier is great for large pieces or pieces that you can't remove from a machine. And the end goal of that OSPO is to have a paintable surface. But if you would rather have a bare metal surface, or if you have a hand tool or a small piece, another really great option for removing rust is distilled vinegar. All you do is take a plastic container, pour in some distilled vinegar, drop in your small piece, let it set for a little while, and the rust will start to loosen. Then come back with some steel wool and just knock all of that rust off. You'll probably have to do some sanding after that point, but that's a great way to get all the way back down to bare metal. That's about it for this video. I hope this was helpful and encouraged you to go buy some used tools. It's a great and relatively inexpensive way to build up the capabilities of your shop. I'll be back later in the week with a project video, but in the meantime, I've got lots of other videos for you to check out, and don't forget to subscribe. I also have a second channel with some behind the scenes and just non-project stuff. That's it for this one, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. It's a grape.